To day 2 of our 2-day workshop. Today, we will be looking in depth at the process and requirements for the SPSA or the School Plan for Student Achievement. First, I'd like to introduce our team. Today, we have Rachel, Helen, Debbie, Anita, Jeannie, Augustine, and Maribel. I think we missed her yesterday, but we definitely don't want to miss her today. So thank you to the team for being here today. Next slide, please. So again, we mentioned yesterday that LACO is launching a new website, and actually that's going to be taking place this evening. So to access today's presentation, we ask you to please click on the link in the chat, and we will keep putting that periodically. So we want you to save that somewhere, because in order to access the materials, you'll have to follow that link until things all get organized and worked out. The presentation, once you click on this, the presentation can be accessed through the icon as shown here. The agenda resources are listed and available as well. And if you're new to our meetings, we are recording today's meeting and we will post it here soon. And once we complete the Q&A, you'll be able to find it here on this webpage as well. As I mentioned yesterday, if you were here with us, you can order a copy of our School Site Council Handbook on the website at the link at the bottom of the slide. And in this handbook, you will receive samples of agendas, bylaws, minutes, and other resources. It's a great expansion of our presentation, and it's meant to augment what we talk about today. This is our agenda for today. As you can see, it addresses all aspects of school plans and planning requirements, including the School Site Council's role in the process. As usual, we ask that you place your questions in the chat box, and we will answer any questions that we can, but we will follow up with written responses in a Q&A that will be emailed to everyone who is registered, and it will also be posted on our Canvas page. And now I will turn it over to Rachel, who's going to start with the School Plan for Student Achievement.
Thank you, Adrienne. Good afternoon, everyone. So as Adrienne mentioned, in this section, we'll be taking a look at the requirements for school plans. The spirit and the intent behind the School Plan for Student Achievement is a cycle of continuous improvement. So it's an ongoing cyclical process where schools evaluate outcomes and progress toward goals, engage in strategic planning with educational partners based on a comprehensive needs assessment, and implement evidence-based interventions and strategies in an overall effort to improve the educational programs and student achievement at the school. And the school-level SPSA development should also be in alignment with the district-level LCAP process. And Jeannie will be touching on this a little later in the presentation. So which schools must develop a SPSA? So first off, a school plan is required if a school operates a program funded through the consolidated application that requires a plan. So that means that a school operating a Title I Part A school-wide program must develop and implement a SPSA. Now, this is the only program funded through the CONAP that requires a school plan. LEAs may also require that its schools develop a SPSA. So for example, a district might have some schools that are not Title I school-wide, but still require these schools to develop a SPSA regardless of their Title I status. And lastly, schools identified for CSI, TSI, or ATSI under ESSA are required to develop and implement a school improvement plan. And Education Code 64001 allows the SPSA to serve as the school improvement plan required under federal law for schools identified for targeted or comprehensive support. There are a number of legal requirements for school plans at both the state and the federal level. And so state requirements for a SPSA are established in Education Code 64001. And so the Ed Code states that a local educational agency shall ensure in the consolidated application that the SPSA has been prepared in accordance with the law, that school site councils have developed and approved a SPSA for each school participating in programs funded through the consolidated application process, and that SPSAs were developed with the review, certification, and advice of the School English Learner Advisory Committee if required. Education Code also requires that SPSAs be reviewed and approved by the governing board or body of the local educational agency at a regularly scheduled meeting whenever there are material changes. Now, we often get questions about what's considered a material change. So it's important to note that Education Code does not define this. This is something that needs to be defined at the local level. So any change in budget and related program services that might raise questions for your educational partners should be considered material. A 10% budget change in a line item is typically used as a rule of thumb for determining what constitutes a material change. Next slide, please. So continuing with the legal requirements, Education Code 64001 specifies that the development of the school plan shall include the administration of a comprehensive needs assessment, including an analysis of verifiable state data consistent with all state priorities and informed by all indicators, including pupil performance against state-determined long-term goals. The development of the school plan must also include the identification of the process for evaluating and monitoring the plan. And since the school site council is responsible for the development of the school plan, the school site council must also be involved in the needs assessment and the evaluation and monitoring of the plan. And so your school site council minutes should document how they were involved in both of these components. The required content of school plans must include goals, evidence-based strategies, actions, or services, and proposed expenditures, including the identification of resource inequities. The SPSA goals must address the needs of students and student groups based on the findings of the comprehensive needs assessment. And the strategies, actions, and services included in the plan must be evidence-based and also aligned to student needs determined through the needs assessment process. Finally, the SPSA must also include proposed expenditures to address the findings of the needs assessment, including any resource inequities identified through this process. So essentially, everything should align to the comprehensive needs assessment, which is why it's considered the foundation of the school plan. And we'll be taking a deeper look at the comprehensive needs assessment process, resource inequities, and evidence-based interventions later in this presentation. So this is a chart that we've shown many times before, and this chart highlights key state and federal requirements for school plans with regards to who is responsible for the development of the plan, when the plan should be reviewed and updated, and what components must be included in the plan. And for your reference, we've included a handout of this chart with today's materials. So the first column lists the state requirements per Education Code. And the second column lists federal requirements for Title I school-wide program plans under ESSA. And the last column in this chart identifies federal improvement plan requirements for schools that are identified for CSI, TSI, or ATSI. So as previously mentioned, California Education Code allows for the SPSA to serve as the improvement plan for CSI, TSI, and ATSI schools as long as the plan meets federal requirements. So a school is not required to have separate plans. So if you have a school that is Title I school-wide and has been identified for CSI, the school is responsible for the components listed in all three columns on this chart. However, you can see that most of the state and federal requirements for school plans are in alignment. So for example, you can see that a needs assessment is required for school plans per education code and for Title I school-wide programs per ESSA, as well as for schools identified for CSI. So the SPSA is a one-year plan that is intended to be developed by the school site council and approved by the LEA's local governing board or body before or during the school year for which the plan is being implemented. Now, statute does not specify a timeline or a specific deadline for when the development and approval of the SPSA must occur. So this is a local decision based on your local context and needs. However, it's important to note that for schools identified for CSI and ATSI, the CDE has indicated that the expectation is that the school plan is fully developed and approved by the school and the LEA by the first day of the school year, so that students and the school receive a full year of intervention and supports. This slide also lists some plan timeline considerations that are dependent on your district or school. For example, the timing around the availability of data and budgets, like when schools receive information about budgets that will allow them to plan for proposed expenditures, or when data is available for schools to be able to measure the effectiveness of their actions. Perhaps the process schools are guided to use in terms of adjustments to the plans and budgets may play a role in the timeline, or also the election and training process for school site council members. And the timeline of the LCAP may also play a role to ensure alignment with the SPSA. So although there is no required timeline or deadline, it's really important to remember that you must have an approved plan in order to expend Title I funds. Next slide, please. So here we have a sample SPSA timeline. As mentioned on the previous slide, there is no required timeline for the SPSA development and approval process. However, an ideal timeline would be one in which the SPSA is developed and approved in the spring of the previous year, so that a plan is in place and ready to be implemented by the start of the school year. So in this sample timeline, you can see that implementation and monitoring of the current plan begins at the start of the school year and continues throughout the year. And then planning and development of the 2024-25 plan would begin in the winter and spring, with the plan being approved by the school site council and the local governing board by June. We know that many LEAs have shifted to a spring cycle for their SPSA development and approval process to align to their LCAP development process. But there are also some LEAs that have a fall or a winter SPSA cycle. So for LEAs with a fall or a winter SPSA development cycle, the important thing to remember is that schools must have an approved plan in place in order to spend Title I funds. Another important thing to remember is that if your SPSAs are developed and approved based on preliminary Title I allocations or budget estimates, which most LEAs do, then your plan will need to be revised to align with the final CONAP allocations. And in a typical year, these amounts are available in January or February with the release of the winter CONAP. Now, there is no required template that schools must use for the SPSA. This is also a local decision. The CDE has developed an optional SPSA template that schools may use. And so here on this slide, you can see a few screenshots of the CDE template, as well as a link to the template at the bottom of the slide. And so the important thing to remember is that you'll want to ensure that whatever plan template you use meets the state and federal requirements for school plans. Also keep in mind that the process of developing the SPSA is equally important, and a school will need to maintain evidence of this process, including the comprehensive needs assessment, development and approval by the school site council, evidence of input from ELAC, and the annual evaluation process. And these requirements are also reviewed through the FPM process. Now, the next few slides are only applicable to single school districts and charter schools. So Education Code 64001J allows for single school districts and charter schools to use the LCAP to serve as the SPSA, as long as the plan meets federal school planning requirements and the stakeholder requirements established in Education Code 52062A, and that the plan is adopted at a public hearing. So there are several considerations for a single school district or charter school when determining whether this option would best support your needs. So for example, if you choose to use the LCAP to serve as your SPSA, then Title I funded actions and budgeted expenditures would need to be included in the LCAP. Schools would need to demonstrate in the LCAP how Title I funded actions are based on a comprehensive needs assessment to support most at-risk students. And then the additional LCAP stakeholder requirements specified in Education Code 52062A would need to be met. So single school districts and charter schools basically have two options. Either combine the LCAP and the SPSA or keep them as two separate documents. So for option one, if you choose to use the LCAP as your SPSA, you would have one plan, the LCAP, which would also serve as your SPSA. So for this option, all federal school planning requirements for SPSAs must be included within the LCAP. And this would include Title I funded actions and budgeted expenditures. Also, a school site council is not required if you're using the LCAP as your SPSA. Instead, you would follow the LCAP consultation requirements. So for charter schools, this would include consulting with teachers, principals, administrators, other school personnel, parents, and students in developing the LCAP. The last four bulleted items which listed are also bolded are the additional stakeholder requirements that are specified in Education Code 52062A. And so these are the stakeholder requirements that are triggered if you're using the LCAP as your SPSA. So you would need to establish a parent advisory committee, and the draft LCAP would need to be presented to that committee for review and comment. And a response would need to be provided in writing to the committee's comments. You would also need to establish an English Learner Parent Advisory Committee if you have an enrollment of at least 15% English learners and at least 50 English learners. Your DLAC could serve as your English Learner Parent Advisory Committee. And so the draft LCAP would also need to be presented to this committee for review and comment. And again, a response would need to be provided in writing to the committee's comments. You would also need to consult with your Special Education Local Plan Area Administrator, or SELPA, in the development of the plan. And lastly, you would be required to notify the public of the opportunity to submit written comments regarding proposed actions and expenditures in the LCAP. Now for the second option, this would be if you choose not to use the LCAP as your SPSA. With this option, you would have two separate plans. You would have your LCAP and then your SPSA. And for the development of the LCAP, you would need to consult with the required groups, which again, for charter schools, this includes teachers, principals, administrators, other school personnel, parents, and students. And with this option, a school site council is required for the development of the SPSA. So again, for single school districts or charter schools, it's really up to you to determine which option would best support your site's needs. And so that concludes this section. So I will turn it over to Adrienne.
Thank you, Rachel. So now we're going to take a look at the school-wide program and in comparison to targeted assistance school program. School-wide program is a comprehensive program intended to improve the outcomes for all students in a Title I Part A school. There are two types of Title I school programs. There is the targeted assistance school program model and the school-wide program model. The targeted assistance school program model is the default program for Title I schools. In the targeted assistance program, services are provided to eligible students based on multiple objective, academically related criteria. And these services must be supplemental to what is being provided to all students at the school. And all of the activities, strategies, and interventions must be evidence-based. The other model is the Title I school-wide program model. So as we go over this, we often get calls about specific questions about school site council and school plans. And always the first question is, what model is that particular school that you're asking about? Because again, the school-wide program is what we're going to talk about next in terms of your school site council and your school plan. So the purpose of a school-wide program is to improve the academic achievement throughout the school for all students, especially the lowest achieving students. In order to implement a school-wide program at the school site, the school must meet eligibility requirements. So if a school is eligible, if the school serves a school attendance area in which not less than 40% of the children are from low-income families, or not less than 40% of the children enrolled in the school are from low-income families. So if a targeted assistance school meets the eligibility criteria, they can move legally into a school-wide program. But the school-wide program requires these steps to be followed. 1, a year-long planning process. 2, you must go through a comprehensive needs assessment. 3, you must create and complete a school-wide plan. And 4, there must be a process in place for annual evaluation. In a school-wide program, the school does not require the identification of individual students for services as required in the task model. And the allowability of costs for services is based on mainly on your comprehensive needs assessment and what is written and approved in the school-wide plan. So let's take a closer look at the first step, a year-long process. What does that mean? Before the year-long planning can begin, the district must first determine if a school is actually even ready to implement a school-wide program. So this is where often there's misunderstanding about what it means to be school-wide. It doesn't allow you to spend it on anything you want. It just means that you have looked comprehensively at the school and you are basically restructuring the academic program in order to meet the needs of your students. These questions need to be considered before starting the year-long planning process. So ask yourself, what is the current status of the Title I program? What is the school's understanding of targeted assistance school programs and school-wide programs? How will a school-wide program improve the academic achievement of your lowest performing students? What is the expected outcome? And lastly, how do you determine if the school is even ready to upgrade the entire educational program? Here's a tool we created, and we have it for you as a handout. It's a readiness rubric. This will help you determine if a school is ready to transition to a school-wide program. And it also will serve to determine what level of support is needed from district leadership. The LEA can use the readiness rubric to determine where the school currently places on the rubric. The LEA should reflect on the various aspects of the school, such as the leadership at the school. What level of experience does the school leadership have? Is it a new principal, or is it a principal that has been part of the targeted assistance Title I program for a while? Then you need to look at the vision and mission of the school and its level of articulation and implementation. What level of collaboration exists among the staff? Are there currently PLCs or some type of structure that includes collaboration? Also, what is the school's level of commitment to equity? How does the school use data to drive instruction? Is it just strong in one grade level versus another? Does the school have a planning process already in place, or does one need to be created or modified? Is there differentiation in classroom instruction that meets the needs of all students? So this readiness rubric will allow the school itself to know where they place on the rubric, but also, again, what support the school leadership and the district leadership will need to look at and address before they even begin the process of doing the comprehensive needs assessment to transition to the school-wide program. The second step is the comprehensive needs assessment. And as Rachel mentioned, we will go deeper in that later on in our presentation. But to explain in this step here, once the district determines that the school is ready, then the school will begin the process of the comprehensive needs assessment. And the comprehensive needs assessment takes into account the entire school's information on academic achievement of all students in relation to the state academic standards, and then takes a even deeper look at the needs of the failing or at risk of failing students. Once this step has been done, now the school is ready to create a school-wide plan. And the Title I school-wide plan must include these required components. That it must include the comprehensive needs assessment, plan development, input and process, plan content, such as strategies, actions, and services. It must include an annual evaluation, the plan budget, and if it's consolidating with this plan with other plans, then a list of programs that are being consolidated. So all of these components need to be embedded within the school plan in total. So when developing the school-wide plan, it's important to remember that there are specific authorized uses of the Title I funds. We always say that Title I is not a pot of money to be used on anything for the school. On CDE's website, you can find the webpage that explains the criteria for an allowable expenditure with Title I funds. This slide is the allowable use that applies to both targeted assistance school programs and school-wide programs. Again, keep in mind that activities and expenditures must be aligned to state academic content standards. The activity or expenditure must be evidence-based strategy. The activity or expenditure must be reasonable, necessary, and allocable to the program. The Title I Part A funds must supplement the funds that would be, in absence of such funds, be made available from state and local sources and not supplant the funds. And the funds are used during the current and or subsequent federal fiscal year. Again, all of these 5 areas are applied to targeted assistance as well as school-wide programs. This next slide, 6 through 10, pertain to if you have a school that has a school-wide program. And the additional pieces apply to them. So looking at, is there a need that was identified from the comprehensive needs assessment? Is it included in the plan? Is the plan been approved by the local board and the school site council? Is it annually evaluating and monitoring the implementation of these activities stated within the plan? And lastly, the activity or expenditure, has it been reviewed, approved, and recommended by school site council to the local governing board? So if you can answer yes to all 10 questions, then that would be an allowable use of Title I funds. If you're running a targeted assistance school program, then 1 through 5 apply to the school, but also these last 3 apply to those original 5. So in a targeted assistant program, the activities are for specifically identified students that are based on multiple educational related criteria that you have determined. The activity or expenditure is included on an ongoing basis, and it's part of the review of progress on these specific students. So ongoing monitoring has to continuously happen, especially if you have the intervention where a group of kids are maybe in a 6-week intervention. There needs to be some monitoring of what they were in the pre, during, and post to monitor their progress. And when you have another group of students that are participating in intervention, those also are going to need to be monitored for progress. And all of this needs to be included in a revision of your explanation of your target assistance program. There's also guidance on staff members paid with Title I funds in a targeted assistance program. And so again, if depending on which program you have at the school, if an expenditure or an activity does not meet all of the stated rationale, then it is most likely not an authorized use of Title I funds. In other words, you have to be able to answer yes to all of those questions. Otherwise, it's not allowable. The last requirement for a school-wide program is here, number 4, the annual evaluation. So the school site council must annually evaluate the progress of the programs or activities towards accomplishing the goals that are set in the school plan. It must be determined whether the needs of all children have been met by the strategies that were identified and used, especially on the needs of low-achieving students. And now Rachel is going to go over more in depth the comprehensive needs assessment process.
Thank you, Adrienne. So again, we'll be taking a closer look at the comprehensive needs assessment process. Actually, if you could go to the previous slide. Okay, next slide. Here we go. Okay, so what is a comprehensive needs assessment? At its most basic, a comprehensive needs assessment is a process or procedure that is used to identify and address factors between current outcomes and desired outcomes. So this process must include steps to provide clarity about the current situation and then identify what is needed to achieve the desired student outcomes. The goal of the needs assessment is to help educators identify, understand, and prioritize the needs that a district or school must address to improve student outcomes. So a needs assessment for improvement is a systemic process used to identify the strengths and weaknesses within the context and constraints of the school, and to dig deeper into root causes. Identifying areas of weakness is an essential first step toward identifying and addressing root causes of poor performance. Root cause analysis is a critical part of the needs assessment process because it addresses the problem rather than the symptoms of the problem. And the needs assessment process leads to the development of a plan to improve student outcomes. It's important to note that a needs assessment is not an isolated tool. It's the first step in the continuous improvement cycle, which includes understanding root causes that contribute to the prioritized needs, selecting evidence-based interventions to address those needs, preparing for and implementing those strategies and interventions, and then evaluating whether or not those interventions are working in addressing the identified needs. And as previously mentioned, the needs assessment is the foundation of the school plan. So all strategies and actions should be informed by and aligned with the data, which will lead to aligned acts of school improvement rather than random acts. So there is not one correct way to conduct a comprehensive needs assessment. And it's important to keep in mind that the needs assessment is a process. And so one resource that we wanted to share that highlights a needs assessment process is the State Support Network Needs Assessment Guidebook, produced by the American Institute for Research under the U.S. Department of Education. And so this guidebook supports the development and facilitation of a needs assessment and lays out 5 phases to support the implementation of a needs assessment. And so these 5 phases include planning, collecting and organizing data, interpreting information, determining priorities, and then lastly, connecting it all to implementation. And so for each phase of the needs assessment process, the guidebook includes critical steps, guiding questions, and also key considerations. And so we've included a link to this guidebook at the bottom of the slide. So the first phase is the planning phase. And this phase really lays the groundwork for the rest of the needs assessment process. It involves defining the desired outcomes and creating a plan to achieve them. And so some key questions to consider during this phase include the following. Why are we engaging in this needs assessment? Who are the key educational partners? And how will they be engaged in the process? And at what points? What core topics will the needs assessment cover? So for example, will it include instruction, assessment, achievement, school climate, or possibly all of those components? And also, how will the results of the needs assessment be shared with educational partners? Data is a foundational component of the needs assessment process. And as mentioned earlier, the comprehensive needs assessment must include an analysis of verifiable state data, consistent with all state priorities and also informed by all indicators. And so schools may also use additional data to measure student outcomes. So this phase involves collecting various forms of data and organizing it in a way that is understandable and also useful for your educational partners who will be involved in this process. And some key questions to consider during this phase include what data is readily available from existing sources. So for example, that might be CAST data, LPAC, graduation rate, attendance, or local assessments. What additional data is needed? And what are the best ways to collect this data? So this might include surveys, observations, focus groups, or even interviews. And another key question is, how will the data be presented so that it is clear and understandable for educational partners? So the next phase is interpreting information. And during this phase, educational partners examine data to draw conclusions, identify trends, and begin to identify improvement needs. And so here are some key questions to consider during this phase. So what does the data reveal? What are the strengths and the challenges of the current instructional program? Were there any themes or trends that emerged from the analysis of the data? Does the evidence gathered support educational partners' assumptions about strengths and needs? And then how can we articulate what we have learned from the data analysis without casting blame? So through the needs assessment process, it's likely that multiple needs or concerns will emerge. So this phase involves prioritizing those needs so that improvement efforts are directed toward a manageable set of priorities, as well as those that will have the greatest impact for students. And so some key questions to consider during this phase include, what findings or themes have emerged that, if addressed, will have the greatest impact on student outcomes? And how many priorities can the school realistically address at once? And is there additional data that is needed to make informed decisions about priorities or capacity for implementation? The final phase of the needs assessment process takes the results and turns those results into something actionable. So during this phase, educational partners dig deeper to understand root causes of prioritized needs so that they can be connected to relevant goals. The process of understanding the root causes of prioritized needs also informs the selection of appropriate evidence-based interventions to address those needs. And some key questions to consider during this phase are, what are the potential underlying root causes of the prioritized needs or concerns? And how will the school connect the needs assessment results to the selection of evidence-based interventions and implementation of those interventions? In order to support schools with the needs assessment process, district leaders will need to determine what level of support is needed. And it's highly likely that schools will be in different places and need different levels of support. And so some ways that districts could support schools with this process include ensuring that schools understand what the comprehensive needs assessment is and its purpose. Also, training school administrators and school site councils on how to conduct a comprehensive needs assessment. And supporting school administrators and school site councils in understanding the dashboard, data analysis, and how to conduct a root cause analysis. So those are just a few examples. This slide highlights a tool that we created to summarize the needs assessment process and the findings. And so we've also included it as a handout with today's materials. Per the Code of Federal Regulations, schools operating a Title I school-wide program must document how the needs assessment was conducted, the results it obtained, and the conclusions it drew from those results. So this tool would help to serve that purpose by summarizing who was involved in the process and how, identifying the data that was reviewed, the results of the data, the conclusions drawn, also the prioritized needs, and the potential root causes of those needs. And so some districts require schools to include a summary of the needs assessment process and the findings within the school plan. And so schools must document the needs assessment process and findings, whether it's included in the plan or in a separate document. So you just need to be sure that you're documenting this process somehow. And so again, it's important to remember that a comprehensive needs assessment is not a thing or a document, but rather a process. So this document, it's not a needs assessment, but it's a tool that you can use to document your process and your findings. The CDE's Continuous Improvement Resources webpage also includes links to several tools and resources to support LEAs in schools with the needs assessment process. And so some of those tools and resources include a needs assessment and root cause analysis FAQ page, planning worksheets, and also a root cause analysis toolkit. And so we've included a link to this webpage on the slide. And so that concludes this section. So I will now turn it over to Helen.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone. In this section, we will be covering resource inequities. Keep in mind that every school prepares every child for tomorrow, no matter home life, level of their parents' participation, their race, or income. Education Code 64001 tells us that every school plan for student achievement, SPSA, shall include proposed expenditures based on projected resource allocation. One crucial part of the SPSA is to address the findings from the comprehensive needs assessment, as Rachel was sharing, including identifying resource inequities. In other words, schools need to figure out if some students aren't getting some of the same resources or opportunities as others. Addressing resource inequities is paramount, as it serves to guarantee that each student, irrespective of their socioeconomic background, is afforded an equitable opportunity to attain a high-quality education. With that, looking at the terms like fairness and inclusion, these are some things to consider. Identifying resource inequities may include identifying ways in which programs may be unfair or lack inclusion. We know that students who come to school with greater needs require greater resources to reach the same high learning outcomes. We understand that personal characteristics such as gender or ethnicity should not stand as an obstacle to achievement. We understand that we must hold the same high expectations for all students, and failing to do so is an inequity itself. Therefore, any gaps we see between student groups should be potential symptoms of resource inequity. When we see a disproportionate representation of one student group from high rates of dropouts or attendance or discipline or achievement, schools are compelled to review what might be contributing to these issues. What might be conditions that might be better addressed to move towards more equitable outcomes for all students? Since high-need students require greater resources to reach the same outcomes, providing equal resources for all might mean that the system has created resource inequities. CDE also states that we can look beyond budgeting. For example, ways in which a program might be unfair or lack inclusion. We may also look at resource allocations within districts or within schools as a potential area of equity concerns. For example, lower quality books or materials, less access to labs, outdated technology, class size and distribution of highly effective or experienced teachers. LEAs are asked to identify current strategies and practices that might be contributing to the identified inequities. These are what can be brought to the light to be addressed in the school planning process. Please read this with me. Any goal of competitiveness and excellence must start with equity or be doomed to fail. Furthermore, CDE also has provided resources and definitions and characteristics around equity. It is important to remember that students come to school with diverse backgrounds, abilities, talents, and challenges. Schools ensure equity by recognizing, respecting, and acting on this diversity. A common misperception is that equity means that all students are treated equally in all situations. In considering resource inequities, we need to start with an understanding of what resource equity is. This definition comes from a working paper on this subject by Jonathan Travers, published through Educational Resource Services, looking at numerous studies related to this subject. As you can see, a review of resource inequities is not only about money. It is not only about allocation of funds to the school. It's about the allocation and the use of resources. Beyond the dollars allocated, also people and time used to create equitable learning experiences for all students. ESSA requires that districts have a methodology for allocating resources to schools to ensure Title I schools receive all the resources they would otherwise receive if not receiving federal Title I funds. Therefore, equity in funding should be given, so what else needs to be also considered? To do this, we wanted to share this resource, a framework for districts and schools going through the process of reviewing potential resource inequities. In the ERS paper, Jonathan Travers, who was also quoted just earlier in this presentation, explored 11 dimensions of resource equity and developed a set of diagnostic questions that can help systems self-assess. He classified dimensions number 1 through 7 as listed here as factors that directly impact student experience, and numbers 8 through 11 here as indirect impacts. There are 7 factors that directly impact student experience, and they include teacher quality, early intervention, and family academic engagement. And some of the other factors that indirectly impact student experiences include school leadership quality, and learning ready facilities. I would like to share a copy of their article. It's linked on this slide. Consideration of resource inequities can inform the assessment of the effectiveness of actions or strategies and provide basis for establishment of goals and expected outcomes for specific student groups. This is a handout in the link that's provided today. This is the LACO developed handout adapted from the Travers work. The handout is in the resource folder, and this resource takes each of those 11 dimensions of the resource equity and poses a set of questions to help districts or schools self-assess their current system. They're separated by district level and at the school level. The district may choose to support schools in identifying a smaller number or targeted subset of dimensions to review based on the needs assessment and achievement or equity opportunity gaps that might be symptomatic of potential resource inequities. So one process to support identification of resource inequities starts with the thorough data analysis and to identify at least one indicator that needs greater attention. Then determine which dimension is or which dimensions are most mostly connected to this area. Then use these resources with the school teams such as ELAC to create a deeper understanding and help determine the resource inequities within the system. After discussions with varying teams, resource inequities will be determined and can be summarized in the SPSA. The team then should explore evidence-based interventions that can best address the identified resource inequities. Let's take a look at a few scenarios in the next few slides. As an LEA, consider this scenario. Sunshine Elementary, located in a suburban area with affluent families, benefits from a strong and well-funded parent-teacher association that actively organizes fundraisers, enrichment programs, and volunteer opportunities. Parents are highly engaged, attending meetings and school board sessions and contributing financially to support field trips, classroom supplies, and extracurricular activities. In contrast, Meadowview Elementary, situated in an urban area with lower income families, grapples with limited parent involvement due to job commitments and transportation challenges. Their PTA struggles to engage parents effectively, and resource constraints hinder the school's ability to provide field trips and extracurricular activities, impacting the educational experiences for students. Considering this scenario, and in the context of people, time, and money, which dimensions are mostly impacted or connected to this area? Take a moment to review the dimensions that are in the yellow box and place it in the chat. So I see some of you guys are direct messaging me, so thank you. Okay, so I see one of the areas is family academic engagement. So once your team determines this area through thorough data analysis and using the handout, here are some possible questions to dig deeper with your team. This is a sample from the chart, the handout based on the Travers work. This is the district level diagnostic questions. Again, in this family academic engagement, as we consider this previous scenario, these questions may help determine the possible resource inequities. These questions include: what percentage of parents receive student progress reports in their native language or otherwise communicate with teachers through interpreters? What percentage of parents report feeling welcome at school? Do they report being consulted and informed about their academic lives and of their children? As teams delve into these meaningful discussions, it becomes increasingly apparent that resource inequities may exist, prompting candid conversations to propel changes in the direction towards equity. Let's take a look at the next scenario. Here's another scenario to determine resource inequities within a school site for school site leaders. In the 3rd grade at Maplewood Elementary School, English learners face academic challenges, increased chronic absenteeism, and a higher likelihood of suspensions. These issues arise from a combination of factors. The EL class is notably larger than others, which strains the teacher's capacity to provide personalized support, and the teacher may lack the necessary training for teaching EL students. Additionally, some EL students grapple with behavioral problems stemming from language barriers and academic struggles, resulting in higher suspension rates and further hindering their educational and social progress. Again, take a moment and review the dimensions in the yellow box. Which dimension or dimensions are mostly impacted or connected to this area? Please place it in the chat. So thank you. And so I see that many of you also chose the teaching qualities. So here are some possible questions to, again, dig deeper with your team. Again, we encountered the sample question. Through this iterative process, the team has identified dimensions that bear the most impact. Subsequently, they engage in discussions to gain a deeper understanding and address these resource inequities. The slide showcases diagnostic questions specifically related to the teacher quality dimension. These questions are reliable measures of teaching effectiveness in place? If so, how are highly effective teachers distributed across classrooms and among students with varying needs? Is equitable access to excellent teaching extended to high-need students to a greater extent than to the lower need counterparts? These inquiries bear substantial implications for schools, its teaching staff, and their impact in fostering equity among students. Therefore, it is imperative to facilitate discussions that actively advocate for resource equity, taking into account considerations concerning personnel, time, and financial investments. As we delve deeper into this data with your districts and your school sites, it's vital to pinpoint the responsible teams that will analyze the data to discern dimensions most significantly influenced and interrelated in this context. Therefore, it becomes increasingly critical to assemble a diverse team and each member possessing their expertise in order to conduct a comprehensive examination of evidence-based interventions. This approach is essential to ensuring the equitable allocation of resources and outcome for our students. Here we have additional resources to support your efforts. The first among them is Equity Blueprint for Action from San Diego County Office of Education. This comprehensive guide equips educational leaders and partners with community-informed insights and research-based strategies aimed at enhancing equitable outcomes for historically marginalized students. The second resource is the Alliance for Resource Equity. It's a toolkit designed to facilitate conversations, promote shared understanding, and collaboratively construct an action plan. And previously shared the article from Travers as an invaluable reference. And lastly, Promoting Equitable Access to Teachers, Peaked video series, and accompanying resources that are for LEAs to collect data and meeting reports obligations regarding the access of low-income and minority students to effective, experienced, and appropriately assigned teachers as mandated by ESSA. These resources collectively serve to drive proactive efforts of promoting resource equity. And finally, I want to remind you of the definition of equity that we referenced today. Resource equity is the allocation and use of resources, people, time, and money to create student experiences that enable all children to reach empowering, rigorous learning outcomes, no matter their race or income. Consider how this framework can be used as a discussion starter to create a common language and facilitate a meaningful discussion around equity and resource inequities. LEAs and school leaders can ask themselves what it means to provide all students with an opportunity to achieve educational excellence. At the school system level, look at the equity and inequity across schools or across the different school student groups. At the school level, looking at the equity across grade levels, departments, and other student groups as well. Here are some additional questions that may be used as discussion starters as you look at how this process can be embedded into your overall SPSA development process for your continuous student school improvement. What would equity look like, and how will we know that we have achieved equity? What evidence will tell us that we are successful or be on the right track? Thank you. And now we will take a 10-minute stretch break, and we will see you around 3:41.
Okay, welcome back, everybody. That was a quick 10 minutes. We are now entering the second half of our afternoon, and we are going to start off with evidence-based interventions. And so we're looking at evidence-based interventions because after we've done a needs assessment, as Rachel discussed, we've identified resource inequities, as Helen just discussed. How do you address those inequities, and how do you meet the student needs? Evidence-based interventions are, next slide, please. Evidence-based interventions are practices, strategies, or programs that have proven to be effective in leading to particular outcomes. In other words, these activities have definitive evidence to show that they produce results when they are fully implemented. The Elementary and Secondary Education Act, ESEA, has consistently directed educators to implement interventions grounded in research. Under No Child Left Behind, districts and schools were called to use scientifically based research as the foundation for educational programs and interventions. Then this was replaced by evidence-based interventions under Every Student Succeeds Act, or ESSA. This shift was designed to help increase the impact of the educational investments by ensuring that interventions are being implemented that have proven to be effective in leading to desired outcomes, namely improving student achievement. The requirement for evidence-based interventions does not require the LEA to conduct their own research, but instead the LEA must plan to implement intervention strategies and approaches that have demonstrated effectiveness by prior studies. There are websites and resources that provide information on evidence-based practices and reference tools. Next slide, please. So Section 8101 of ESEA defines the distinction between evidence-based strategies that have been proven to have statistically significant effect on improving student achievement and those that demonstrate a rationale or a likelihood based on research to date to impact student achievement. These criteria are reflected in 4 tiers of evidence for intervention. Next slide. The tiers of evidence ratings are determined by research study criteria. The more controlled criteria provide an increase in strength of evidence. So the tier 1 moves from the strongest level of evidence to tier 4, which is the lowest level and is more of a rationale and not yet proven effective, but has a rationale for being effective. This gives a wide range for LEAs to select from. The selection of programs and/or practices to address student needs is critically important because remember, this is a huge commitment, not only for the monetary investment, but the investment of time for training, planning, and implementation. All of these things factor into this decision. Getting buy-in and commitment from principals and teachers will also be critical in this selection. Their understanding of these tiers and their participation of selection of strong evidence-based programs will serve to support success of implementation of such programs. Next slide, please. In these next few slides, we're going to share some resources to support this work. So on this slide, there's a link here to a 13-minute video, as well as to the PDF of the non-regulatory guidance that was just revised in September 2023, just a month ago, with guidance for using evidence to strengthen educational investment. So this guidance is to help LEAs and other educational organizations select and implement interventions that improve outcomes for students. Next slide. This is a screenshot with other links for the CDE and to West Ed. And both have great resources for building background and understanding of evidence-based programs and practices. They both have posted about using, generating, and sharing evidence-based interventions and strategies to support students. These are great resources to use with your instructional teams and your educational partners. They detail the difference in the tiers of evidence and how to understand the difference in ranking of interventions. And it will help build background information as you work through selection of how you identify, how you address your identified needs. It is important to build background and a deeper understanding to be purposeful in the selection of your programs or instructional practices that are proven to yield results. Remember, education is a big business. And while we as educators, we're not getting rich, there are a lot of companies trying to sell their products. It is critical to be selective and understand your students' specific needs and what research-based approaches have been proven to be most effective in meeting those needs. Next slide, please. And as we look at the LCAP template, the CSI selection here we see on the screen, the CSI section requires for districts that support CSI schools to not only use the school level needs assessment and identify the resource inequities, but also the selection of evidence-based interventions through and the implementation of their plan. They are also required to describe how they monitor and evaluate the CSI plan and implementation. So think about this as happening in your LEAs now. Whether or not you have CSI or ATSI schools, think about how you engage your leaders and teams and your educational partners. What is the approach that you use to review and select interventions or different programs to address any of the identified needs? How prepared are your educational partners to participate in the process to evaluate interventions? What might you do to build capacity and to participate more meaningful? Considering your past or current approaches to providing guidance to schools, is there anything that you would like to keep or change about how you approach providing guidance to your schools? The resources that we provided you here would be able to help you in developing your process as you move forward with your educational partners. And now we're going to turn it over to Anita for steps to developing the SPSA. Anita?
Okay, well, thank you, Debbie, and good afternoon, everyone. We're in the home stretch. We've gone over a whole lot of information up to this point, and if you find that in the midst of doing all this important work or guiding your site administration through this process, you need some additional information, feel free to reach out to us. We're here to support you. Okay, so as Debbie said, next we'll synthesize and review the process of developing the school plan for student achievement in 7 doable steps. So let's do this. The SPSA involves a continuous development, implementation, and monitoring cycle. This graphic here offers a 7-step process in developing and annually reviewing your school plan. The process a school puts into motion alongside its school site council, staff, ELAC if required, develops an effective school plan that advances student achievement and improves academic outcomes. And so the 7 steps are the following. 1, analyze student achievement data with your educational partners. 2, measure the effectiveness of current strategies. 3, identify goals and key improvement areas. 4, define timelines, personnel, and expenditures. 5, recommend the SPSA to the local governing board or body. 6, implement the school plan for student achievement. And 7, lastly, monitor the implementation. So let's take some time to delve into each step. Step 1, analyze student achievement data. As Rachel mentioned earlier, the SPSA must be based on an analysis of verifiable state data, consistent with all state priorities and informed by all indicators. And this data can include things like, it includes the CAS SBAC results in language arts, math, science, your LPAC results for English learners and long-term English learners, chronic absenteeism, attendance rates, suspension rates, graduation rates, as well as local benchmark assessment and other formative assessments at your school. It is a best practice to identify the assessments that will be analyzed and to present the data from various viewpoints, such as from the all student group and by disaggregated student groups to ensure that the data is analyzed with an equity lens. Step 2, measure the effectiveness of current strategies. Schools conduct their needs assessment on the effectiveness of the school's instructional program and the input from educational partners. Data may be collected using your site, district, or CDE developed tools and may include things like surveys, interviews, focus groups, observations, or a review of records and/or documents. Your school site council should consider the relationship between the current instructional program as informed by the data collection tools. An accurate assessment and a thoughtful analysis of the current instructional program is essential to raising academic performance. Also in this step, remember that the SPSA must be developed with the review, advisement, and certification of applicable school advisory committees, such as the ELAC if required at your school site. The advisory committees may wish to present their recommendations to the school site council in writing to facilitate communication. Advisory committee recommendations should be reflected in school site council meeting minutes. And the last part of this process enables the school site to determine areas of need and components of the instructional program that continue to be effective. Once the effectiveness of current strategies have been measured and analyzed, determine whether these will continue to be adopted, adapted, or abandoned. In step 3, you identify your goals and key improvements. The LEA's LCAP identifies goals from all applicable state priorities and articulates the LEA's expectations, metrics, and actions. School level goals should be aligned with the LEA's LCAP. This helps to ensure that both the LEA and the school sites are working in tandem. Once goals are established by the school site, determine which improvement strategies and related expenditures will be implemented and monitored. To be most effective, ensure that goals and improvement strategies are SMART. That is specific to the areas of need, measurable, attainable, realistic, and time-bound. All right, step 4, right in the middle of that 7-step process, involves defining timelines, personnel, proposed expenditures, and funding sources. For each goal identified in the SPSA, the school site council must specify the actions to be taken to accomplish the goal, the dates by which actions are to be started and completed, the persons responsible, expenditures needed to implement the action, and each funding source budgeted for the goal. Please keep in mind that expenditures, whether they are paying for personnel, materials, or services, are allowable if they are an effective means of accomplishing the purpose of the program, they are reasonable and necessary, they supplement, not supplant the general program, which means they cannot pay for services that are required by state law or services that are provided to ineligible students. Ensure that all expenditures paid for with Title I funds are included in your SPSA. Step 5 is the recommendation of the school plan to the local governing board or governing body. After the advisory committee, such as the ELAC, if applicable, have reviewed the proposed SPSA, and the school site council must approve the proposed SPSA at a meeting for which a public notice has been posted. By signing the SPSA, the school site council is attesting to the following assurances. 1, that the school site council was properly constituted. 2, that it has reviewed its legal responsibilities. 3, that it has sought input from the required advisory committees. 4, that it reviewed the content requirements for all programs included in the SPSA. 5, that the plan was based on the analysis of current practices and student academic performance. And 6, that the plan was formally approved by the school site council before recommending it to the local governing board or body for approval. Now, here in green, if the local governing board or body does not approve the plan, they must communicate this determination to the school site council with the specific reasons why and ask the school site council to revise the plan and resubmit for approval. And very important, I know we've heard it many times throughout this presentation, but in red, please keep in mind that the activities and expenditures in the SPSA are not authorized for implementation until the SPSA is approved by the governing board or body. And step 6, implement the SPSA. Once the SPSA has been board approved by your school board or by your governing body, the district and site administration are responsible for implementing and evaluating the activities in the SPSA. Implementation of the plan includes assigning, directing, supervising project staff, purchasing materials and equipment, and accounting for the funds. The school and district administration may also support the planning process by providing training and information to the school site council and applicable advisory groups, or by developing proposals for the school site's consideration. And 7, monitoring the implementation of the plan. Once the plan is approved and implemented, the school site council is responsible for monitoring the effectiveness of planned activities and modifying those that prove ineffective. Monitoring is more effective and efficient if the plan defines actions, dates, estimated costs, and measurable anticipated student academic outcomes, as well as all the persons involved and their responsibilities. A plan that is too general can minimize accountability and diminish results for student achievement. As the implementation of planned activities unfolds, the school site council should verify the success of each major event for identified students and share this information with advisory councils and other interested parties. There are times, however, when mid-year changes to the SPSA may be necessary. So in this case, a school site council may decide to amend their SPSA if, for example, a major service or activity is ineffective, material changes occur that impact the academic programs, they are unable to secure staff, equipment, or materials, school boundaries or demographics have changed, or an activity is not compliant or supported by the school community. The school site council may amend the plan at any time. Any revisions that would substantively change the academic programs funded through the CONAP must be reviewed and then approved by the local governing board. And finally, as a resource, especially for those of you in high schools, CDE and the Accrediting Commission for Schools, the Western Association of Schools and Colleges, WASC, have worked to create an alignment with the accreditation cycle and the SPSA. The link provided on this slide here will take you to that plan, to that documentation or guidance. These plans are closely aligned to the goals, actions, and services detailed in the LCAP. For high schools, consider how closely these plans and processes are related and how you can leverage this to bring your teams together to support each other through the development of the plans. Okay, thank you very much for your attention. And next we have Adrienne Balcazar.
Thank you, Anita. We're going to take a closer look at CSI, TSI, and ATSI plans. If a school has been identified for CSI, TSI, or ATSI, LEAs and schools must work with educational partners to locally develop and implement a school improvement plan, which improves student outcome. Now, sometimes people get it confused because they think that it is the SPSA and it's actually a school improvement plan. But Ed Code allows the SPSA to serve as the school improvement plan for schools that have been eligible and identified as CSI, TSI, and ATSI. For schools that have been identified for CSI, the site CSI plan must be developed. And regardless of whether a CSI school takes the money or not, the plan must be created and implemented. So if you have actions, you may as well take the money to pay for those actions. But this plan for CSI sites must be based on a school level needs assessment and informed by all state indicators. It must include the evidence-based interventions and identify the resource inequities. The LEA must describe in their LCAP how they have supported the CSI school in developing the school level needs assessment, selecting evidence-based interventions, and identifying resource inequities, and explain how the district is going to monitor and evaluate the implementation and effectiveness of the school site's school improvement plan. For schools that were identified for ATSI, the school improvement plan must be based on indicators that are in the statewide accountability system and informed by all indicators, including student performance against long-term goals. It must also include evidence-based interventions and identify resource inequities. It is not required for the LEA to include a description of the ATSI schools in their LCAP. For schools identified as TSI, their plan has the same requirements as ATSI, with the exception of evaluation of resource inequities, which is not required. So as mentioned earlier in the presentation, federal planning requirements established in Ed Code Section 64001 allows the SPSA to meet ESSA requirements for the CSI and the ATSI planning. It also allows schools that are single school districts or charter schools to utilize the LCAP to serve as a SPSA, so long as it meets the ESSA planning and educational partner requirements. So it serves as basically 3 separate plans, but it's housed together in one LCAP. So it's important to understand that you have requirements for the school improvement plan, requirements for the school plan for student achievement, as we spoke about earlier in this presentation, and the LCAP, the local control and accountability plan. So schools that are identified for CSI or ATSI, you could choose to have 3 separate plans or any combination if you choose to have a school improvement plan, and then therefore you want to, for single schools, districts, and charter schools, if you want to combine your SPSA with your LCAP. So again, making sure that everyone understands these are 3 distinct plans, but if you are a single school district and charters, you can combine all 3. And if you are a regular school, you can combine your school improvement plan with your SPSA. So I hope that's clear. But again, we want to make sure that everyone understands 3 separate plans, and they can be combined in different ways, depending on what your school is, whether it's a school, a district with many schools, or a single school district or charter school. Here's a table that explains the requirements for TSI and ATSI, TSI. For example, if you look at the responsibility for plan development on the second row, for CSI schools, the LEA has the responsibility for the plan development and implementation. That's why it's recorded in the LCAP. Compared to TSI or ATSI schools, where it's the school's responsibility to develop the plan and implement and monitor the implementation of the school improvement plan at the school site level. Here's the chart that we previously showed earlier, and the highlighted areas are the key state and federal requirements for school plans, such as, if we take a close look, the comprehensive needs assessment, evidence-based strategies and interventions, and resource inequities. The last column identifies specific school improvement plan requirements for CSI, TSI, and ATSI schools per ESSA. So you can see the differences between what is required for each of those program improvement plans. And now we will hear from Jeannie, who will discuss how the LCAP Federal Addendum, and the SPSA should be aligned and connect to your district's goals and outcomes.
Thank you, Adrienne. Our training will finish up today with taking a brief look at the LCAP Federal Addendum, and how they align with and impact the school plan to support equity of outcomes. So if we go to the next slide, please. As we finish up today, we're going to highlight the interdependence of multiple documents and really highlight the importance for school site councils and advisory committees to understand the content and relationship of these documents. The LCAP Federal Addendum, and the SPSA are all connected to supporting improved outcomes for students. The LCAP sets district priorities, goals, and outcomes for all students, and actions to address 8 state priorities and specific needs locally identified for specific student groups. This is a foundational plan laying out the LEA's core program. The addendum describes how supplemental federal funds support LEA's goals within the context of specific federal requirements. And as you know, school plans for Title I schools describe how the school is using Title I funds to close achievement gaps. Some LEAs may also require non-Title I schools to develop SPSAs, and they may ask them to describe in that plan how specific actions are being implemented at the school site to support measurable student outcomes. And as you heard today, there may also be SPSAs serving as the school improvement plans. So let's take a look at the purposes of each of these documents a little more closely. We'll take a look at an overview of the purposes for these 3 documents. So here, the LCAP is the LEA, or district level plan. It's a plan for all students that describes how the LEA is supporting all students and student groups in the 8 state priorities, and how it will support equity of outcomes for the lowest performing student groups. In addition, the LCAP demonstrates how the LEA is providing increased or improved services for 3 targeted groups in proportion to additional funds LEAs receive for students who are low income, English learner, and/or foster youth. So the LCAP Federal Addendum is a complement, and it's an LEA level document with the purpose to describe how the LEA is meeting federal program requirements by supplementing the LEA's program outlined in the LCAP, and how the LEA is addressing federal provisions that are not specifically addressed in the LCAP. A companion to the LCAP Federal Addendum is the CONAP. And as you heard today, the school plan for student achievement is the school plan outlining how to improve academic gaps, particularly for low achieving students most at risk of meeting state standards at Title I schools. And you also heard about other schools that may have an SPSA. So let's take a look at a little more closely at the provisions in the LCAP Federal Addendum. And so here, LEAs are providing this narrative or a description that's explaining their strategy for using federal funds to supplement and enhance local priorities or initiatives that they're providing with state and local funds that are reflected in their LCAP. So for each of the ESSA title programs for which an LEA receives funding, LEAs provide a narrative response to specific ESSA provisions or requirements that do not specifically align to state priorities addressed in the LCAP. So on the slide is an example, and this example is providing the ESSA provisions required to be addressed that are related to the Title I Part A program. And you can see here that this includes requirements for educator equity, parent and family engagement requirements under Title I, school plan requirements for school-wide programs, requirements for targeted support programs, and as applicable, programs for neglected or delinquent children. Additionally, are included are provisions addressing services being provided for homeless youth and student transitions, as well as use of funds. And so for reference, the screenshot on the right includes the cover page for the LCAP federal addendum. And on this cover page, you can see listed all of the title programs to be addressed as applicable to the ESSA funding for which the LEA applies. Moving on to the next slide, we offer a chart that shows where requirements for each of these documents come from. It shows the timing for submission, the approving entity, the focus of the plan, and the locus of decision-making. You'll notice here that the addendum is colored differently, and that's because the LCAP and the SPSA are plans. And the addendum is a descriptor of how specific ESSA provisions not addressed in the LCAP are addressed by the LEA. This narrative is updated annually as applicable. It is important that district and school site personnel and school site council members and advisory committees are aware of what's being provided in the LCAP and described in the federal addendum, so that planning at school sites can build on these services. This is a key takeaway for this section. Next slide, please. And so it's also important to note and understand that there's a statute that the superintendent of a school district is required to review school-wide school plans for student achievement to ensure actions in the LCAP are consistent with strategies in school plans. And this requirement is embedded in the LCAP approval process requirements for school districts. So what does it mean? And how does it really happen? Okay. This is really critical, and the intent here is for there to be an iterative process with information flowing back and forth from the school and the LEA, so that the needs assessment and annual evaluation processes from the school and the LEA are aligned. So decisions can best address site and LEA level needs. This back and forth can ensure that resources are most effectively leveraged, provide coordinated support, and avoid duplication of effort. Okay. So what does this process look like at your school site and in your LEA? How is it clear that your SPSA is adding to what's included in the LCAP? Next slide, please. A helpful resource that does address the planning process for the SPSA and the LCAP is available on the CDE website. And we've included the link on the slide for your reference. And here CDE provides considerations for how planning for the LCAP and the school plan can be aligned. The website explains how the design of the optional CDE SPSA template intentionally mirrors the LCAP template. It uses common vocabulary and sections addressing continuous improvement. And here the intent is that each template is designed to reflect a planning process based on a continuous improvement model, where educational partners engage in a needs assessment and analysis to determine needs, and then develop strategies to address those needs and resource inequities. And each includes outcomes to support reflection on effectiveness of implementation. So with this interconnectedness of these plans, it's really important to consider the ongoing continuous improvement process. And so in closing today, we offer some things to consider about the components in the planning process for the LCAP and the SPSA, and how a continuous process, such as what the team has outlined today, can support your LEA, school site councils, and advisory committees to engage in an iterative process to identify and address school level and LEA-wide needs. Aligning the LCAP and the SPSA planning timelines can allow for LEAs and SSCs to leverage and coordinate resources to address needs at the school site and across the LEA. LEAs might begin by aligning timelines, so schools and the LEA are talking about the same things at the same time and coordinating strategies. An aligned process can also provide staff opportunity to have their ear to the ground during school plan development. In this way, district staff and school site leadership working on the LCAP are aware of needs arising from the schools. Then, if resource inequities are identified, LEA staff are aware of that, and they can determine with educational partners what should or could be addressed in the LCAP at the LEA level or school-wide at specific schools, and then the SPSA can build on that. Additionally, LEA's support in aligned processes can assist in determining if there are gaps or resource inequities in mandated services or basic services for all students that need to be addressed at the district level. And so the graphic on the screen identifies 3 LCAP phases in the annual LCAP continuous improvement cycle. These include LCAP implementation in the fall, goal analysis beginning in the winter, and plan development and adoption in the spring. So we ask you to consider, how does your SPSA continuous improvement cycle align to the timeline for the LCAP process? And we also know that many of your schools or LEAs may have practices in place that support an aligned planning process, or you may have ideas about what would work. And so we ask in closing today for you to share your insight with colleagues by responding in the chat to the 2 questions that are posed on the slide. How do SSC and our advisory committee members know about the LCAP process and what's in the LCAP? And the second question, how can SSC provide input about school level needs to inform LCAP planning? So if you'll take a moment to put your thoughts in the chat, we would appreciate it, and we know your colleagues would learn from your expertise and experience. And if we go on to the next slide, while you're completing those thoughts in the chat, we really want to take time to genuinely share with you how much we appreciate you joining us this afternoon. And we ask that you please take time to provide us with your feedback about today's presentation. Your responses really are important to us, and they help us to reflect on our practice and guide our future planning so that we can best address your needs. So on behalf of the team, we ask you to complete the evaluation for today's workshop, and we thank you for joining us this afternoon. Have a great rest of your day.